Hi, it's Dwight again. I want to talk to you today about the political economy of Japan. Japan is pretty much one of the most obvious examples of a successful coordinated market economy. Concepts such as total quality management, lean manufacturing, just-in-time production, for many years have been prominent in large and medium-sized businesses in Japan. The rise to prominence in the 70s and 80s, gave birth to a whole publishing industry around, Theory Z, the art of Japanese management, books like this that lauded the idea of how the Japanese managed their companies and made them productive. Even as Japan's economy fell into recession in the 80s, in the 90s, its systems were admired by many outside of the country. But they've also faced some very severe problems since the 90s. Sometimes it's called the lost decades, and it's under intense pressure for reform. But we need to go back a ways to really understand Japan. For a long period of history, the country was a bunch of disunited feudal entities. They were all run by daimyos or feudal kings. Each of these little kingdoms, is pretty much now a province of Japan. So that's an idea of path dependence there. But they were involved in very frequent and bloody civil wars. I was up until the era of Tokugawa Ieyasu, from about 1600. What he did there was to, first of all, he cut deals with some of the local kings to give their fealty to him, and then kingdom by kingdom, they eventually conquered all of Japan. The Edo period, the Tokugawa era, the Shogunate, as is often called, lasted from about 1600 to 1868. And during that period of time, the country deliberately cut itself off from particularly European influences. The only trading they did was with Korea and Okinawa. Economic growth during this period was considerable, though. Tokyo grew to have a million residents, which at that time was the largest city in the world. But they ruled isolationist, domestic growth strategy. They basically didn't want to trade with anybody. But in 1853, the famous Black Ships, commanded by Commodore Perry from the U.S., sailed into Edo Bay and threatened to basically shell Edo Castle unless the Japanese opened up their country to trade. And at that point in time, of course, historically, the port of Yokohama became, the key influence there, because after the Americans opened up the port, the French, the British, the Russians, the Spanish all had trade missions there. So, but that led to a period of widespread, unrest. The Japanese didn't really like all that foreign influence and all those foreigners themselves floating around. And the shoguns, you must remember, ran the country as absolute dictators. And although they paid fealty to the emperor, not so much. They kept the emperor on a very small budget so that he couldn't get involved in politics. They kept him isolated, in the imperial palace. And there was an internal revolution driven somewhat by the instability of this foreign influence, but also because the inherent contradictions of the shogunate, paying fealty to the emperor while still ignoring him, came to the fore, and a revolution happened called the Meiji Restoration, because they restored the Meiji emperor to his throne. From the Meiji era onwards, though, Japanese government policy was to import technology, techniques, and systems almost wholesale from the West. They brought in British shipbuilders, American engineers, French armaments experts, American soldiers to give them the industry and military that they thought they needed to compete in the 20th century. It began with an importation of skills under strict guidance, and basically, after you've taught them what you knew, they wanted you to leave. During that period of time, Japan became a major industrial and imperial power. Powerful families grew to prominence because, remember, we went from the Shogun era where it was all family, but these were samurai families. So we had the trading companies now that were started up. The Zaibatsu, these family trading companies, became very powerful and influential in the Meiji government. So, because Japan had grown so strong, it embarked upon several military ventures. The first of these was victory in a war with China in 1894 to 95. Some major gains in a brief war with Russia in 1904, including the Sakhalin Islands, which are still in dispute a century later. It also invaded and occupied Korea and Manchuria, and set up, their own puppet government of the Manchukuo in Manchuria. By 1937, they got themselves involved in a full-scale war with China. And of course, basically what Japan was trying to do was establish their hegemony over the Pacific, in all the regions therein. But there was one thing standing in the way to accomplishing that, and that was the Americans, particularly the American Navy, which at that point in time was becoming more and more prominent, which of course led to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. As Roosevelt termed it, a day which would live in infamy, led to a war which, in all honesty, was pretty much a foregone conclusion. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, one of the goals was to take out the massive petroleum tanks on Hawaii. Because remember where Hawaii is located. It's almost in the center of the Pacific. So the Americans had to ship oil from San Francisco and Los Angeles out to Pearl Harbor, put them in these massive storage tanks, and we needed that oil and the coal for our ships. If they could take that out, the Japanese general staff figured that we might just cede the Pacific to them. But as Admiral Yamamoto himself said, I think we may have just awakened a sleeping dragon. And of course, that war went on for several years until Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But by 1945, that era of unification, industrialization, economic growth, and militarism had led Japan into ruin. I mean, literal ruin. We'd pretty much bombed all of their infrastructure, which some argued was a gain later because they actually had to rebuild from scratch. I mean, just like when we talked about Germany before, it was pretty much greenfield sites because everything worth having was reduced to rubble during World War II. But after Japan unconditionally surrendered to MacArthur on the battleship Missouri, MacArthur became the basically viceroy of Japan from 1945 to 1952. And his word pretty much became law. Much of the Japanese legal code was rewritten. Their industrial complex, was largely redesigned by MacArthur. And of course, he put in place the famous Constitution, modeled somewhat on the U.S. system of government, but also guaranteeing that the Japanese military can only be used for defensive purposes, something that they're still struggling with today. There was a vested interest, therefore, in the U.S. making this work. So still under the auspices of the Marshall Plan, money started flowing in. And we started rebuilding things. We started with infrastructure, but again, the basic idea was to make sure that market capitalism flourished here because we'd already recognized the threat to the communist model. After World War II, the economy was so shattered, Japan was largely reduced to a barter system. So, one of the first things was setting up a viable economy, getting the infrastructure going. And it proved tougher, than you might think, because they had no networks, no infrastructure, no currency. But it very quickly rebuilt. As we well know, the Japanese government protected nascent industries. They used active stimulus policies to keep the economy moving. And then when the U.S. left in 1952, the Zaibatsu business group started reforming again. You see, there's a difference in opinion here. If you look at Germany and Japan, South Korea, they have these large industrial combines. I mean, in Japan, they're called the Keiretsu, all organized around a central bank. In Britain, Canada, the U.S., this kind of collaboration is illegal. It was Theodore Roosevelt who actually brought in antitrust legislation when he was president, long before his cousin. And so to this day, that type of industrial arrangement is illegal in much of the industrial world. But the Japanese had what they call a developmental state. They had a very powerful industry, the Ministry of Industry, Trade, and Investment, MITI, who kind of decided, which industries would be favored, which would get funding, and which didn't. Workers were given good pay and conditions and job security. Basically the idea of lifetime tenure. But you have to remember that there's a very good reason for that happening there. I mean, most of their young men had been killed in the war. So they had a massive human resource shortage. So what you do is you take the best care that you can of your human resources and you figure out ways to use them most effectively. Hence, the ideas of total quality management, which they brought from W. Edwards Deming, who largely rejected by American industrialists. Came over to Japan and showed them how to do things, get it right the first time, you don't pay for rework, basically, is what TQM is all about. Lean manufacturing, we don't have a whole lot of work in process inventory. These ideas the Japanese adopted because of necessity. And it must have worked because, Japanese quality goods now are pretty extraordinary, as anyone who drives a Lexus will tell you. So you had these company men, the salarymen as they're called, who had a job for life, white-collar executives, and of course for the unionized blue-collar skilled workforces. Remember, though, that Japan has something curious in its history as well. They actually have company unions, where you're negotiating basically with a union that is also negotiating with the companies. So they're a very hybrid kind of model. On the other hand, there's almost no industrial unrest. So things were going swimmingly, and under the stewardship of the state, these protected companies grew at a tremendous rate. They set up these long-term relationships with their suppliers. That was always one of the keys to the Japanese system. There was also a lot of cross-shareholdings, defensive mutual shareholding amongst friendly firms. I mean, if you look at Mitsui Bank, and all of its entities, Mitsubishi, there's 27, 30 companies involved in one of these keiretsus, all around one large trading bank. I mean, what is it? Mitsui's got 27, Mitsubishi 28, Sumitomo 20, Fuyo 20, and these are figures from 1995. But during the period from 1950 to 1973, Japan had a fantastic growth rate, one of the most rapid and sustained in the OECD, breaking records for year-on-year growth, kind of structure on low-cost, labor-intensive industries, chemical, steel, iron, coal. And you see that pattern there, right? With every country that adopted this kind of top-down industrialization system, they always focused on these key industries because they're key. Prime Minister Ikeda famously announced an income doubling plan in the early 1960s. And you know what? They kept it. Requires a 7.2% annual growth rate to double your income in 10 years. And the Japanese did it, surprisingly. Almost amazingly when you consider what they were coming from. Japan at this time in the 70s really started to move, really started to grow, really started to expand. Raised a little bit of alarm bells with the rest of the world. There was some rather interesting literature written at the time. Some of the movies, talking about, some of the Hollywood movies were kind of paranoid about the Japanese taking over, California, for example, or basically buying it, or up here in Cannes. I mean, they bought huge chunks of Cannes real estate because they had the money. Firms such as Sony, Matsushita, Toyota, Honda became very famous during that period of time, and rightfully so. There was a lot of discussion at that time. How did the Japanese pull this off? And the discussions pretty much reflected people's prejudices as opposed to any real reflection on the way the Japanese did it, which were largely through being smart managers. Although, the government was picking winners and losers, and the problem with that is that governments tend to be much better at picking losers than winners, although MITI had a long streak of hits. On the other hand, they famously told Soichiro Honda that he couldn't export to the U.S. because the market was already saturated. Thankfully for Honda drivers, Honda ignored MITI and did it himself, and rather successfully. But during the 80s, prices got out of hand. We developed this massive real estate bubble. The patience of the Japanese financial systems, they use patient capital, because the bank is on your board of directors. They're not going to sell. I mean, if you need a little bit more time. The problem is the Asian idea of losing face. So we're going to keep funding this idea long past the time when it makes any sense. I mean, Sony famously pursued the mini disc long after its viability was already shot. And by doing so, they missed the MP3 revolution completely. And it's why Apple took control of that, long before Sony had a chance, and they were the world's premier electronics firm at the time. But other parts of the society, didn't grow quite so fast, and there really weren't, and there was some serious inefficiencies, like in the building industry. Some of this was brought to the fore in the 1995 Kobe earthquake. Around 6,400 people perished. But basically, it shut down central Japan, for years, because it found itself that the Japanese industrial structure really wasn't very flexible. They didn't seem to have the ability to set up a temporary facility and soldier on, such as, So basically, large chunks of the economy moved elsewhere. They moved south, and it moved, north and east. But by the 1990s, Michael Porter at Harvard and some of his colleagues wrote a book called Can Japan Compete?, which was quite shocking given the previous 20 years of literature on Japanese management. The years 1997 and 99 were the worst, with some fairly massive bankruptcies, scandals, plant shutdowns that were running out of control. The financial scandals were particularly galling to the Japanese because they considered themselves above that. And then finally, of course, they had the Tokyo real estate bubble. Tokyo is still some of the most high-priced real estate in the world, but the prices got truly to nosebleed levels. And they still kept pumping the money in. You know what happens to bubbles. Every bubble known to man has burst. And when the Tokyo bubble burst, it took most of the economy with it. It ushered in a major period of retrenchment. Firms got smaller, some firms died. The Japanese, I would argue, probably didn't react as forcefully as they should. I mean, some of the banks are still insolvent to this day. They've got way too many non-performing loans on their portfolios. But again, because of this very curious Japanese customs and culture, they can't bring themselves to shut them down, fold the banks into something that's profitable. So a lot of mainstream authors, would blame, overly meddlesome policies, over-regulation, and I tend to agree. The media had gotten too powerful and too connected to the Japanese political parties, and most particularly, the Liberal Democrats. Because I remember that for a big chunk of Japan's post-war history, they were one-party state. I mean, the opposition never actually won government for about 50 years, and that's not healthy for anybody. So, big problem here is for Japan is kind of the future. The median age of the population is expected to rise from 41.5 in the year 2000 to 51.1 in 2025. And it gets worse from then on. The Japanese are incredibly healthy people. They have the highest proportion of 100-year-olds in the world, and that's going to continue to grow. And somewhere around 2050, they're going to reach a point where there are more people retired than there are working. And that's a demographic bubble that somewhere along the line is going to have to be dealt with. And there's not a lot being done right now. And we'll get to a bit more of that in a minute. From around 2004 onwards, the Japanese economy finally seemed as if it started to grow a bit. But you got to remember that interest rates were effectively zero for over a decade at that period of time, and there are no more policy tools left when you're at that level. I mean, they're already pushing deficits at twice the level of GDP. You can't spend any more money, and you can't make the money any cheaper. Negative interest rates are possible, but it gets really scary about that point. But 2008 came along, and that hit Japan, as badly as did anyone else. Compared to January 2008 figures, the volume of exports from Japan was down 45.5%. The Japanese share market lost about half its value. And in 2009, Toyota, for example, announced its first ever annual loss of around $4.3 billion US. And on top of that, there was a devastating earthquake and tsunami hit the Tohoku region in March 2011. And they're still dealing with the aftermath of that. Politically, they've been in turmoil since 2011. There's been a series of scandals involving, Japan's prime ministers. But now we have, Abe in charge, and it seems as if things have settled down quite a bit. So hopefully, that will somewhat settle things. I mean, Japan is still the world's third largest industrial economy. They've shown an amazing propensity. If you go from the pre-Edo period to the Shogunate, to the Meiji Restoration, to the almost military government in World War II, to their massive success post-World War II, an amazing resilience in these people. So I'm still hopeful. But they've got some really interesting policy challenges that they have to accomplish, particularly that demographic bubble that they need to address. Well, that's all I have for now. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.